If you're just getting into film photography and you're not sure which film to buy, what all those labels on the box actually mean, or what kind of result to expect, then don't skip this video. Before we get into the labels themselves, first we need to talk about the two most common film formats. Because the very first thing you need to know is which format your camera uses. The first one is what's often called the Leica format, or simply 35mm. As the name suggests, it uses 35mm wide film. You might also hear people refer to it as the Leica format. But why is that? So here is the short version. 35mm film already existed long before it was used for still photography. It was originally made for motion pictures. In 1913, Oscar Barnack adapted the same film for photography while working at Leica. By running the film horizontally instead of vertically, he created the now famous 24 by 36 mm frame, which eventually became the standard for 35mm photography. As Leica cameras became incredibly popular, photographers naturally started associating this format with the brand, and that's how the name Leica format came to be. Today, you'll usually hear people call it 35mm or 135 film. And if you're shooting digital, this is also where the term full frame comes from, since modern full frame sensors share the exact same dimensions as a 35mm negative. You'll still come across the term Leica format every now and then, especially in older photography books or among longtime film photographers and lovers. The second format you'll often see is medium format. As the name suggests, it's physically larger than 35mm, but unlike 35, the exact size of the negative depends on the camera you're using. With medium format film, one side of the negative is always 6 centimeters because that's the width of the film itself. The other dimension depends on the camera, which is why you'll find formats like 6 by 4.5, 6 by 6, 6 by 7, or 6 by 9. The roll of film is always the same length. The only thing that changes is the frame ratio. And because the frame size changes, so does the number of photos you get on a roll. For example, a 6 by 6 camera gives you 12 exposures, while a 6 by 9 only gives you 8. In other words, different medium format cameras all use the same film. What changes is the film gate inside the camera, which determines the size of each negative. Also, there are even larger formats out there, including panoramic cameras that can produce massive negatives like 6 by 17 centimeters. If you're buying medium format film, the label you're looking for is 120. So, to keep it simple, if your camera uses 35mm film, you'll be buying film labeled 35 or 135. If you're shooting medium format, you'll be buying 120 film. Now that we have figured out which film format your camera uses, this is probably a good time to subscribe if you're enjoying the video and want to learn more about film photography. Now, let's move on to the next label found on a roll of film. The very first decision every film photographer makes after arriving at a location is surprisingly simple. Which film am I going to load? And that decision usually comes down to a few key factors. Let's start with ISO. ISO tells us how sensitive the film is to light, and choosing the right ISO mostly depends on the amount of light available. If you are shooting outside on a bright sunny day, you'll usually be perfectly fine with slower films like ISO 100, 125 or 200. On the other hand, if you are shooting indoors at night or you need faster shutter speed to freeze motion, you are much more likely to reach for something like ISO 400, 800 or even higher. One thing that's very important to remember is that once you load a roll of film into your camera, you are committed to that ISO until the roll is finished. Unlike digital cameras, you can't just press a button and change the ISO from shot to shot. There are ways to change film ISO in the middle of a roll, but you'll usually lose a few frames in the process. In practice, this only makes sense if you develop your own film, since you'll need to separate the differently exposed sections and process them individually. So, yes, it's possible, it's just not something I'd be excited to do. When talking about film speed, there is another concept you'll hear quite often: push and pull processing. In simple terms, pushing or pulling film means exposing it as if it had a different ISO than the one printed on the box. For example, if you have a roll of ISO 400 but expose it as if it were ISO 800, that's called pushing the film. If you take the same ISO 400 film and expose it as ISO 200 instead, that's called pulling the film. This allows you to use the same film at a different effective speed than its native ISO. But there is one very important thing to remember. If you have pushed or pulled a film, you need to let the lab know before it's developed, because the development process has to be adjusted to compensate for the way the film was exposed. Technically speaking, you're intentionally overexposing or underexposing the entire roll and then correcting for that during development. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that not every film responds well to push or pull process. Black and white films are generally much more forgiving and can usually handle larger adjustments, while color films often have more limited push and pull range, and in some cases is not recommended at all. So, before trying it, always check whether the particular film you're using is suitable for push or pull processing. Now, ISO isn't just a technical specification. It also has a huge impact on the overall look of your image. Depending on the film speed, the developer you're using, and the way the film is processed, you'll end up with either finer or more pronounced grain. Generally speaking, the higher the ISO, the larger and more visible the grain becomes, while lower ISO films usually produce finer grain. That's the general rule, although two films with the same ISO won't necessarily look the same. For example, an ISO 400 film from Kodak won't have the exact same grain as an ISO 400 film from Fujifilm, and honestly, that's a good thing. The size, shape, and character of the grain will vary from one film stock to another, and sometimes even from one roll of the exact same film. That's one of the things people fall in love with when shooting film. Every frame has its own personality, every negative has tiny imperfections and subtle differences that make it feel organic and alive. The more you shoot, the more you'll start recognizing which films you enjoy the most, and you'll naturally learn when each one fits the look you're after. The next label you might come across is the X-coding. The X-coding is basically a barcode printed on the film cartridge that allows compatible cameras to automatically detect the film ISO. If your camera has electrical contacts inside the film chamber, it will read the DX code and set the ISO for you automatically. If it doesn't, you'll need to set the ISO manually every time you load a new roll. This is especially important if you're loading film into reusable cartridges. If your camera doesn't allow manual ISO selection, you can actually buy DX code stickers and apply them to your reusable cartridges, allowing the camera to recognize the wanted film speed automatically. The next label tells you how many exposures you'll get on a roll. Factory loaded 35mm film is usually available with either 24 or 36 exposures, although you'll occasionally come across 12 exposure rolls as well. Besides preloaded rolls, you can also buy film in what's called a bulk roll. A bulk roll is typically 30.5 meters or 100 feet of 35mm film that you load into reusable cartridges yourself in complete darkness. One of the biggest advantages of bulk loading is that you can decide how many frames each roll will have. If you prefer shorter rolls, you'll be able to switch film stocks much more often instead of committing to 36 exposures every time. Next, let's look at the film type itself. This is where you'll find out whether a film is black and white, color negative, or color positive, also known as slide film. Even though this sounds straightforward, there is one more thing you should always check: the developing process. Not every film is developed using the same chemistry. Black and white films are developed using dedicated black and white chemistry, and different developers can produce noticeably different results. But there are exceptions. For example, Ilford XP2 Super 400 is a black and white film, but instead of traditional black and white chemistry, it's processed using C41, which is the standard process for color negative films. If your film is labeled color negative, it will be developed using the same C41 process, which is offered by any lab that develops color film. The third option is color positive, also known as slide film. Instead of producing a negative, slide film produces a positive image that you can view directly on a light table or with a slide projector. These films are developed using the E6 process, which is not as common as C41. The last thing to pay attention to is color temperature, usually shown in Kelvin. Most color negative films are balanced for daylight, which is roughly between 5200 and 5600 kelvins. That means they'll produce the most accurate colors when used outdoors in a daylight or with a flash that's balanced to the same color temperature. If there is no specific color temperature mentioned on the box, it's safe to assume it's a daylight balanced film. You might also notice the letter D, like on Cinestill 400D. The D stands for the daylight, a naming convention borrowed from the motion picture industry, and it usually means the film is balanced for around 5500 Kelvin. Of course, not every film is daylight balanced. Some films are designed specifically for tungsten light, which is around 3200 Kelvin. These are often marked with the letter T, like Cinestill 800T, or simply labeled as tungsten. On older film stocks, you might even find a small sun icon for daylight balanced film or a light bulb icon for tungsten balanced film. So, what happens if you use the wrong color temperature film? If you shoot daylight balanced film under tungsten light, your photos will usually shift toward warm orange tones, although the exact color cast depends on the type of indoor lighting. On the other hand, if you shoot tungsten balanced film in daylight, your image will have a noticeably blue cast. So the next time you pick up a new film stock, don't just load it into your camera. Take a minute to read the label. It tells you a lot more than most people realize. And understanding it can save you from expensive mistakes while helping you get the results you're actually after. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.